I would just like to ask you about the 30s in another aspect. Were you at all closely following the international developments, the rise of Hitler and Mussolini, Munich, and the clash between the dictatorships and the democracies?
Inevitably, yes.
And I was thinking that perhaps it was during this period that you were germinating the idea for the road to serfdom. To what extent did Nazism directly influence that book?
Yes, very much so. I mean, the similarity between the various forms of totalitarianism became very obvious to me. At the same time, when I became so very much aware that certain ideas of engineers and natural scientists who interpreted the world too simply were really the intellectual source of the belief that we can direct all the activity in the service of social justice. I happened to, just a tiny little before and early in the war, do a study of the intellectual origin of socialism, and discovered in this that already the early French socialists were essentially totalitarians, that Hitler no less than Lenin or Marx even drew on what was in its consequences a totalitarian conception of government, improved only by the idea that we are going to do it in the service of some idea of social justice, but that they would be bound to use the same compulsory methods, essentially restricting and diminishing individual freedom, always in the service of a very good purpose, of course, not in the service of a particular group, but that basically there was no difference between socialism and fascism.
But isn't it fair to say that in Britain over the last 30 years that we have gone a considerable way down the direction of increasing state control over industry, over planning, over education, over the provision of welfare and so on, and yet people in this country don't feel any less free?
They are not much less free because they have never been consistently moving in that direction. See, when at the end of the war I published the book, The Road to Serfdom, I did never say it is alleged. As I say, once you start on this track, you are bound to belong to the bitter end. It's just a warning that if you tried consistently to follow the principles on which it is based, then it would lead to totalitarianism.
But in fact, there were a number of intellectuals, I think Keynes was one, who argued that you could risk doing what I think he called dangerous acts if the community had strong moral traditions which would inhibit them from oppressing the people.
I didn't deny it even at the time, but I'm afraid moral traditions are made by history. If you move in a certain direction, moral traditions change, and this confidence that the moral tradition of the English was so fundamentally different from those on the continent rather exaggerated the position. The English were not immune, but they were up to a point protected against moving too fast and too far in the dangerous direction. So I think this confidence which incidentally Churchill also had. I had one single conversation in my life with Churchill, who had by that time been acquainted with my book, and he said it was very instructive, but it would never happen in England. It was his absolute confidence, again trusting what was presumed to be a peculiarly strong, I suppose, individualism or adherence to a moral respect for the individual, which I'm still not convinced the English really have. They've been warned by what they've seen to happen elsewhere, and they've become cautious. But I don't think the term you occasionally use by socialist politicians are very reassuring, really.
The road to serfdom certainly altered your own life. I mean, from an economist who was known to a small circle, you became suddenly a notorious political figure and almost a figure in the 1945 general election. It was even a bigger success, I think, in America.
Well, it's a very different kind. You see, the English had been aware of these problems. You could accuse me of having exaggerated an argument, but it was not a wholly new conception. Some of the more reflective people, well, the fact that Orwell, of course, was arguing at the same time, and I no longer believe it. I did believe at one time that he was directly inspired by my road to serfdom. He had written a review of that book, and I thought that had started him, but it's now clear that by that time he already had the draft of Animal Farm ready. So he must have arrived at this general view independently of anything he learned from him. He was not the only one. So this was not a completely new idea. It was an idea to which the English public was somewhat prepared. The Americans had only been in the last 10 years become converted to a sort of socialism. It was only the New Deal. And it was the latest exciting discovery of all the intellectuals. And I was directing my argument against what all the intellectuals thought was a great achievement of the last generation. So the result in America was that both sides talked about my book. Nobody really read it or studied it. In fact, I remember vividly a letter from one great American philosopher to an English philosopher who blamed the English philosopher for having merely quoted my book, this dreadful book, which I, of course, have not read.